the Lead Generation World podcast. My name is Michael Faree. We got a great show, of course, for you today. We've got Kenneth Kinny, also known as the Shark, with us today. Kenneth has his own podcast called The Shark's Perspective. Make sure to check it out. I think he's got like over 100 episodes with marketing professionals from across the country. Really, really great stuff. He's also the Vice President of Marketing and Digital Strategy at the AI Media Group, and often speaks at a number of different shows and conferences across the marketing world. And certainly he's going to be speaking at Lead Generation World as well. He's going to be talking about voice and how that's playing out with regards to marketing and lead generation. So voice with, hey, Alexa, hey, Google, Siri, all that sort of stuff. And podcasts and everything sort of revolving around voice. So that's going to be a really, really great session. Don't forget, on that note, to register for Lead Generation World. Its prices right now are $395. They're going up, though, to $595 December 1st. So make sure you register as soon as possible. Also want to thank our headline sponsors, Digital Media Solutions and Lending Tree. Thank you very much for the support. Really helping us get this show on the road, as they say. So without any further ado, let's jump in. Let's bring Kenneth into this podcast and start talking some marketing. To the Lead Generation World podcast. I've got Kenneth Kinny here with me today. Kenneth you speak at a number of events throughout the year. You have your own podcast called the Shark's Perspective. Your VP digital marketing, digital strategy and marketing at AI Media Group.
Right.
You got a full schedule.
I'm staying pretty busy. It's amazing as you make this transition to create your own lead generation, if you will, as a little more of a personal brand than when you work for a large corporate brand, which I've worked for before. But I'm staying pretty busy. Speaking at a number of events, really looking forward to Lead Generation World, though. That's exciting as well. But I think there's so much of an appetite today for what I hope I'm putting out, which is good information to help businesses grow, not just a lot of fluffy stuff. And so I think a lot of the tactics that I've used over my own career, I'm a really old millennial from 100 years ago when I was a millennial. I'm bringing a lot of those practices that I've used, having worked for a brand, having worked for an agency, having worked for a consulting firm, having worked in big data, having worked as a publisher. I mean, that wealth of experience that I bring now, I'm trying to give away to help businesses grow and, drive better marketing and advertising efforts.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. So you now before we dive into like a whole bunch, a lot of that stuff, you're in Memphis, Tennessee. You went to Memphis University, graduated with a business degree there, international business degree, but jumped right into marketing out of college.
Yes and no. So degree changed.
Okay.
It was a degree in international business because I was able to get out. This kind of goes back to a diving story. So I lived overseas for a while, got sick from some shellfish. In the time that I had to drop out of school and then come back, the quickest path to finishing my degree, like super quick, because once you've dropped out for a health reason, I had, ate some bad shellfish in a third world country, and that's another story. But once you have to go back and finish, it is the quickest path to finish that you can achieve. It is not a long game. It is, how do I get done quickly? Because when you break that momentum, it's crazy. So I was doing a lot of diving trips, spending a lot of time in the water in the northeast of Brazil, way too much time, and ate some bad shellfish, came back. Doing that, then I decided here's where I've got to go to get out of school quickly. It was a degree in international business as a switch from marketing. But my focus has always been that way. I actually jumped into recruiting as a first, job, really getting my feet wet in that space. And I got fascinated by building brands with people, personal brands. So that personal brand imagery, that was a little bit differently than the way we look at typical marketing, advertising, and PR and things like that. It just gave me a sort of different perspective. I from there jumped into really branding the company and then working with them on consulting engagements in the MarTech space, which we worked with a lot of large clients in Memphis, whether it was FedEx, International Paper, AutoZone, all these large companies. And then I began working with colleges and universities across the country. And a lot of that messaging can be somewhat generic in your application as to there's differences of course, but when you look at how people build their personal brands and all the things that go around it, and also with corporate brands, there's a lot of things that you play off of that are best practices. So that's really what sparked my interest. So it all comes back to diving with sharks, eating some bad shellfish, and that's how I got to where I am today.
Yeah, I do want to get into the whole shark thing first, or at some point, but because you said you do a lot of diving and all this sort of stuff, but I do want to touch on a couple things first. You then went to you worked for True Green, which was a brand. What's your sort of take on brand marketing? It seems like that's sort of a little bit of a passion for you. Is there a outlook that you have with regards to marketing from a brand perspective?
Yes and no. I mean, I'm not a brand. I don't think of
Okay.
myself naturally as a brand person, and I know absolutely nothing about lawn care. I refuse to learn anything about crabgrass or grub worms. I'm not, somebody
Yeah,
that necessarily looked at the home services space and thought this is my true passion. It just wasn't.
sure, sure.
It's a great role for a lot of people. But what I really enjoyed there and with other clients that I've worked with, because worked with a lot of large clients, is we're all trying to compete in a space to just, for example, with lead generation, trying to draw leads in. If you think of it from this aspect, the the brand positioning, creating a niche in particular, and how you position yourselves for branded search terms. When you think about competing in that space, that focus that you can put on a brand really extremely interests me. How you create your category, how you become a category leader. I've never been a person who wanted to live in the non-branded search term world and
Mhm.
overpay for something for this, for that example, like lawn care. You're going to have to, most businesses will, but there are a ton of examples for, you know, coffee shops near me where people are competing because everybody's literally on their phone putting in Starbucks near me, not coffee shops near me. So from a lead generation standpoint, when you think of it that way, that kind of positioning and finding that uniqueness for your brand so that customers and consumers will remember you has always been the focus for me.
Yeah. And how do you, when you find that focus, how do you, what are sort of the challenges with exploiting that, for a company, right? Is focusing on, okay, here's our niche and here's what we do really well. How do I go out there and exploit that and get that out to the masses and guide those, customers to you?
Yeah, and that's a great question that will have a very complex answer and should, because the more
Yeah.
complex it is, and it depends on whatever the product, whatever the service, whatever the vertical industry you're in, it really will make a difference when you hone in and know what that is. Or at first, most companies that I've consulted with don't know what that is. They don't know how to define that strategy early on. And once you define that strategy, it's very easy, at least for me, to think of how I build out from there what that complex niche is that they've helped define. And the reason I say that is because there are million, there are a million or gazillion companies rather that are lawn care providers, for example, to use the True Green reference. How do you focus on making your brand the synonym for whatever that non-branded term is really where you've got to hone in on the focus of understanding what customers are looking for and fixing their problem first, not offering your product or solution only. And I think part of that is where the trap gets pulled in for a lot of brands, is they're so focused on building out that part of the brand messaging and less on the product solving. And that's where you're going to help define your niche and really articulate that niche as well. So you've got to know what your core is, but I'm one of the marketers who often focuses on, you know the niche as opposed to the large reach. That's a problem that we've become in as sort of a spray and pray problem. And then you're competing and paying Google plenty of, dollars like everybody else to get inside that audience space. But the more defined you get with understanding what the solution is you provide to people based on what their feedback is, the problems they're trying to solve, is really where you just articulate it from there.
Yeah. It sounds like a more of a human nature approach, right? Because when you use empathy and you're starting to like find and empathize with the people that actually, their problems, you're able to bring them kind of into your own wing and into your own community and help solve those from a completely different approach from sell, sell, sell. It's like, here's how we're trying to help your problems. And that
Yeah,
seems like a different, more humanistic way of going about it.
I agree. I think one of the values with specifically in lead generation, or where the people that perform really well in the space, it is very often that the ones that succeed and do it well are the ones who are able to truly think like a consumer, because they, as consumers, I think that gets so messed up so often by so many people, by so many agencies that don't really understand the needs of the consumer to help solve their problem. But if you do, you can carve out a remarkable niche. And if there are a gazillion examples out there, but when you think of local listings, again, sort of creating that synonym for whatever your product or service is based off their problem that they're trying to solve, you can really create something that helps them want to do business with you and come back for more.
Yeah. And I would think like what I see a lot of lead gen companies, with the trap that they fall into or we fall into is that we're always talking about performance and hitting numbers and generating leads and blah, blah, blah. But we're not, and we're doing so thinking about creative, we're thinking about colors, we're thinking about how to get people to convert more
Yeah.
into leads versus actually maybe connecting with them, so there's like a short term, we get stuck in that short term. How do we turn this click into a lead, and versus how do we create this click into a lifelong customer?
Well, I mean, I think I'm still a proponent of using colors and
Oh yeah,
arrows and
100%.
all
Yeah,
all that kind of
definitely.
stuff to drive it as you are.
Definitely.
But I do believe that the smarter brands typically move to the top when they're focused on the lifetime value of that customer, focused on a repeatable customer, as opposed to trying to get the numbers that they need to get for this quarter or this sales cycle.
Yeah.
And that is one of the biggest parts of the trap that I see over and over and over, is when somebody's trying to meet those short-term numbers. People should spend as much time looking at the leads that they bring in as the ones that are running out the door, because that problem with churn is it's just very mind-numbing, and it's a wasted amount of spend. I mean, I was talking to somebody recently about an example of a very large company in the home services space. Not anybody that I've worked for, but I fired them as a customer, and I had a lot of conversations with their teams, their customer service teams, about how I didn't want to ever work with them again. Please stop calling. Please stop emailing. Everything else. I've asked them, pull me from your list and things like that. Then I still get a ton of messages and calls, bad, where I've had to like get to the point where I say, look, I've got you on my do not call list. Do I need to call an attorney? Oh, sorry, those systems don't talk. Now
Yeah.
I can deal with it where I can just unsubscribe or hit them to spam. But really, when they just keep pushing bad practices based off of junk automation that they can't connect their devices and their MarTech and their marketing and their customer service and their sales, it's just really what's destroying a lot of brands today, and they don't even know how to connect the dots internally. Or and it used to be just a problem with affiliates. I can deal with an affiliate. Affiliates are generally more nimble, and they can turn off that spray and pray approach quickly.
Yeah.
But a lot of the big brands have no idea how bad their automation and sales techniques are combined, and that's what gives so many in the lead gen space a bad name.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you can't talk and get somebody out of a funnel, you can get them in the funnel. You got to be able to get them
Yeah.
out of the funnel just as quick. One thing I want to kind of continue to go down the road on is sort of that messaging and content marketing,
Mhm.
and I think this kind of will lead into a couple other conversations here.
Sure.
But with regards to the content, marketing, what is the view? I mean, back, for a long time, it was, writing articles, blog posts, this sort of thing. But I feel like it's gotten a lot broader now. Now there's a lot of video. Now there's all these different social media platforms. What's the, what's the game plan when it comes to content marketing these days?
For me, it's not any one channel or any one tactic. They,
Yeah.
anytime I talk about whether it's video, audio, blog, podcast, paid search, whatever it is, it really always comes back down to alignment for me. From when you think about how a customer looks at you, you could have, and there are plenty of examples I could give you. I could pull up the references. There are plenty of examples where I've got 20 different messages on email, video, social, some paid search ad snippets they don't align or make sense to me. I don't know if it's even the same brand a lot of times, and I start to question that. It's a phrase that I use all the time. The confused buyer always says no. And why in the world would you want to have so many different siloed efforts? Because for me as a consumer, and I've talked to a lot of consumers and asked them these questions because I want to make certain that this makes sense to them as well. They're not taking the time to pick apart your brand. This is not a bloomin' onion that that you get at Outback that starts out small and then just peels apart. These are hundreds of different messaging points that don't make sense. Now we know that the messaging doesn't have to be one message. It doesn't have to be, a 99.95 offer
Hmm.
100% of the time. But there has to be some kind of consistency like that. And I think content as well, when you think about content, I use this a lot in presentations. I talk about pillared content clusters. When you create a content cluster and you think about content marketing, you create one pillar piece of content. You create various offshoots of that content, but they all drive back to that same form of messaging. When you think about your advertising efforts, you should have one consistent theme of your message. And the problem is it's becoming so siloed, it's spreading so far apart with so many different siloed teams. Because if you look at large brands now that are spending a lot of money on their advertising or their content or whatever forms of marketing and advertising they do, there is often a large delineation between that messaging that started out when you were an entrepreneur and you were selling the exact same product or service. It has become, it started out with ABC and it turned into, 12 rings down the road, it's rubber baby buggy bumper by the time it gets to the customer. And the customer's not going to take the time to you know, uh, take an interpreter and try to uninterpret that message that's going to convince them to buy. People are complex enough to handle that messaging, but there's also 500 other brands selling a similar product or service that's out there right now. And a lot of the times that alignment of messaging, and I think it's why a lot of the startups are killing it right now, is because they're more succinct, more nimble to pivot on that messaging, and they keep it more aligned to where people can understand it and not overly confuse it.
Yeah.
There's just so much noise out there with content that you've got to keep it tight.
Yeah, and one of the things that gets I think gets confusing, or a lot of companies, at least smaller startups, are looking at just from a social media standpoint and an organic standpoint, self-generated content. They Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn.
Mm.
I mean, it's so much to manage when it comes to content, and how to really utilize these things. Um,
It's a
what's a
dangerous path because
Yeah.
everybody wants to go down a channel strategy, as opposed to, at least in social media, there's not a there should not be a Twitter strategy. There should be a conversation strategy. Now
Got it.
you can take, in my opinion, you can take different forms of that. I mean, to me, it's like, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram is Spanish and German and French. it's a different way of saying a lot of the same messaging, though. Maybe it's through a different medium, like a picture, but you're still, for a brand as opposed to a person, for a brand, for a corporate brand, you still should be driving through a central, threaded alignment of your idea, because customers are trying to solve problems. They're not spending time like you are in meetings with 5 other people on your social team or 5 other people on your SEO team, picking apart, how do we do this messaging? They're sitting there going, they're looking at Acme Brick Company, and they only want to know, what kind of bricks does Acme sell, and does it fit for my home? Not, oh my gosh, what's Acme's social strategy on Twitter?
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways of engaging that, and there's obviously different ways of playing off that. I think if you look at Wendy's, historically, they're completely left turn on how they started doing a couple of years ago their Twitter strategy. It's brilliant, but
well, what makes
it's
it brilliant?
It's funny, and it's back in the face, and it's a conversation.
Yeah.
Well, the brilliant part is it's actually a conversation with people. It just comes with a little more sarcasm.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why I think it's brilliant, because I'm very sarcastic. But I don't think of myself as brilliant, but I think there's the way their strategy is, it's a conversation with people, but it still interjects in conversations about their hamburgers and fries and stuff like that. It's not a completely left field strategy, which is what happens so often.
Yeah, maybe it's just not as, politically correct, I guess, or marketing correct as you would think, right?
No,
from a big brand.
I'm shocked that their communications team ever let that out the door, because usually they want only something that gets approved on a brochure. It's a big problem that happens all the time.
But to your point, though, this is what is attracting you to their feed, and you're,
Absolutely.
the Wendy's is that, hey, this is a little maybe rough around the edges, maybe not always approved, and it's funny and entertaining. It's not hurting anybody, and listen, we're selling burgers and fries, right?
Well, they're giving people something to remember.
Yeah.
And that's part of the core messaging. But what they're giving them to remember is fairly aligned and succinct, as opposed to 20 different messages, going off in 20 different directions. So directionally, that's the value of brand for me in lead gen, that brand messaging.
Yeah. What do you think about when it comes to content? We talk about articles, but it seems to me that, at least from a B2B perspective too, a lot of video is taking place, right? So whether it's LinkedIn or whether it's Twitter, there's, snippets. We do it at Lead Generation World, put some of these up in snippets and do different things. The consumption, and then you have Instagram, and then of course TikTok now, which is, video based as well. And corporations are grabbing a hold of that too. Is content consumption maybe shifting from letters and words to videos and voice?
I think it will come back and obviously be more. I'm so big on where I think we could go with 5G and beyond with video and the quality. I still envision, I do this often at a lot of conferences where I talk about TV and digital a lot, and where we could go with video. I still love the idea that one day that you go to Google, for example, and you look up lead generation conferences. And let's say typically you're going to find 3 listings underneath that are going to be paid advertisements. And then you're going to have, the rest of the stuff underneath that, hopefully that's organic content. And then everything else goes to die on page 2. But on the first 3, I love the idea that not just are we going to possibly in the future go to Google and click to go somewhere. Maybe you're creating much more of a richer snippet or a richer ad that shows video of the conference, not just here's where I drive you to a page,
right?
But so that when I look at my search, and maybe it's not a lead generation conference, maybe it's bricks, and I brought Acme Brick as an example, or a lawn care company or something like that. Maybe it can produce amazingly different, high quality content that allows me to see and feel and touch, if you will, that type of what I'm investigating and searching for. That really interests me extremely. Having audio, we're already doing this now with all the home devices, to where you're having a dialogue in a more robust way with an Amazon, a Google Home, or Siri to provide you back richer explanations than just, here's a link, I click on it, I go to a page, I read something, I'm sparked by the interest, here's an offer, they're going to retarget me to death. I'll fill out a lead form, and then their sales team calls me, and it happens all the time. But I'm much more interested if I see something that really robustly jumps out at me. Now, where I think some of the content will change, I hope, is that more of this is where people are owning their own IP. And I mean, if I can put that content on my own channel and drive people in to a much richer type of content on my own channel, as opposed to having to only go to YouTube, hoping they view through, and then I click on an ad. I mean,
Right.
I hate that idea. I would love somebody, and I use this as an example in some of my presentations. I would love for the idea for somebody to, like Home Depot, for example, or Lowe's, or any of those kind of companies, to create a TV show, a streaming video type show that is fantastic, where, let's say, two unknowns go in, and you've never heard of them. They could be in a rural part of America, but they've got great personalities. They go in and they start flipping houses, and maybe they do it as some sort of to help some couple with a house. Well, they've been doing that for years with Fixer Upper, one of HGTV's most famous shows. But why wouldn't Home Depot, which probably they create a ton of short videos
Mm-hmm.
that they post on Facebook, why not create better kinds of really rich, robust content? Stick that on your own site with the right type of, obviously, server that can handle that traffic. But if you start thinking about the kind of content that you could produce as a lead generation tool, if you imagine the number of leads that you could get if you were Home Depot and you own the rights to Fixer Upper 5-6 years ago, whenever it started, and you put a lead form or something
Sure.
there. I mean, you talk about taking some of the best things that a lot of the channels, like Netflix, is producing on content, or Amazon. I mean, Amazon's the king of content production. Oh, and by the way, they have this awesome e-commerce site that delivers stuff to your door within a day or
Right.
two. I mean, it's just amazing when you think of examples like that aren't so far flung anymore. And I use a couple of different examples just to get people's brains really thinking. But when you think of the types of content that we can produce for lead generation, it's much more robust, and should be, than just getting an agency to produce a 30-second to 2-minute video that they stick on Facebook. People don't hear the audio, and then you got to just remind them to add the transcript because people don't read. Give them something that's really pulling them in. Don't just force them into everybody else's social channel, and then that becomes your social channel strategy. And I think video and audio, whether you're creating the content gated or not, could be an amazing lead generation tool for a company to really also show their thought leadership. I think one of the ways that you can do that with showing your experts is not just to get them on podcasts, for example, but
Mm-hmm.
demonstrating what they do. And again, this analogy that kind of goes with home services, but if you were thinking of it that way with Fixer Upper, that's the kind of thing that would pull people in. Why couldn't Starbucks create a fictional show and call it Friends, where everybody meets together and sits at a coffee shop, and
Right.
you go to starbucks.com/friends, and then they serve you ads and, retarget all the stuff you normally do when people come in. So I think there are different ways of content as we look forward to the future, and the
Yeah.
technology advances are coming that are pretty exciting. And I think it's going to be a challenge for companies to create content that's not just content shock, which I don't need to read one more blog. It's one of the reasons I've tried not to do another blog. I mean, there's millions of blogs. There are hundreds of thousands of not great podcasts that die off after 6 episodes. So kudos to you for doing a killer one for now, as long as you've done it. I mean, so many of them die. But when you think about SAP did this, SAP just won a big content marketing award. They produced a fictional piece of content that in the B2B space for lead generation called Searching for Sell IE. It was a play that they will credit towards what GE did with two of their fictional podcasts called The Message and I forget what the Afterlife. So Searching for Sally is based off of an apprentice who travels through time, who talks about Leonardo da Vinci. He says he was the apprentice to Leonardo da Vinci. And it's this whole conversation about time travel and Leonardo da Vinci and everything else. Well, it just so happens that SAP introduced a product called Leonardo. So there was a back end way for them to leverage that content without overselling and then producing something of value to people that they want to consume in their normal lives.
Yeah.
That's interesting with woven music. I think that's where we're going to have to go with a lot of this content, other than just saying, I got a blog post, here's the service that we do, you know,
Yep.
buy the bricks from me and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
we've got ways to start thinking creatively to bring in people.
Yeah. Well, because when I look at my kids, I have a 16-year-old girl and a 13-year-old boy. They are communicating generally by FaceTime, Snapchat, messages back and forth, a lot of video. My son actually gets on the phone every once in a while. They call each other. My daughter, I've never seen her talking voice ever. Always FaceTime.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a visual video consumption sort of group, that wants to take in even small bits or communicate or whatever it is. I don't know if I've ever seen her go to a website and actually read some reviews on things,
No,
but it's
exactly.
video reviews, all that sort of stuff.
Well, I'm really interested to see down the road as well where companies are able to do this a lot more, to where when you're buying a product or service, you're not just, to your point, not just calling into a call center, because there are still a ton of conversations that need to be had over the phone for something that's more complex than a simple e-commerce buy. You need to have a conversation with somebody over the phone. There
But
is
being able
some
to see
value.
them, yeah,
There is some generational value in particular to being able to see them. A lot of people don't want to get on video. I'm not on video all the time. I got I say a face for radio and a body for podcasting, but there is a value to have, in that generation that's very sociable, that they're going to still want to text, but when they have a complex problem they want to have, that interaction could be done more with video. And it can be a dramatic lead generation, sales enablement, alignment that could really take off and help. So I think having that offering as well, and you've got to have the right kind of staff, the people, there's some security issues. There's a lot of things that go into that, but the technology is jumping so far ahead that we need to start thinking that way as well.
Well, what's interesting, I was just thinking about, is that, we always look at these, the younger generation go, oh, they're so disconnected. They've got all this technology devices. They're not connected with their friends and all this sort of stuff. They play video games. But the fact of the matter is they're actually much more connected than maybe we were when we were kids. We'd have to go talk to them across the street and do all this sort of, but now they're always having that human connection face to face, whether it's these, these different videos and all that sort of stuff, it's.
And there's a real value that I talk about that a lot of times in branding. I was two cans in a string. So, but there is a different form of communication that people have via video communication than when they're, personal versus where they are on the phone.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other dynamic that a lot of people aren't even going to be able to afford to be able to do. I just think that there is a real value to having that as an option.
Yep.
Just like we can connect on, we push everybody to connect on social, to connect, let us cookie you so we can retarget you. Things like that where brands feel like they have to push themselves on the customer or the consumer to be able to interact. This is really providing yet another lever, if you will, to let people communicate back with you, because the goal should be to turn into leads and sales and have a more comfortable relationship. I mean, you think of the people that you meet, you're going to have a better, we're doing this via video. It's a more conversational, relaxed, intimate, if you will, conversation than if it was just over the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Having a real conversation now between a brand and a customer. We don't like people that show up at our door and do door to door. I don't.
Right.
But there's a value to having that interaction with somebody if anything, just through a video chat on occasion when they want it, not
Right.
when
And
the
that's the
brand
key. You
thinks it's
don't
the
like
push.
people knocking on your door when you don't want to,
Mm-mm.
but you're not going to second guess going out to that store that you want to go talk with somebody or have a consult
No.
with. That's
But
not
if
a
you had
problem.
a problem with a product you bought, or if you
Yeah.
wanted somebody to, if you were trying to upsell somebody, wouldn't it be nice to strictly have the ability to FaceTime with them, for example,
Yeah.
or set up a Zoom or whatever you use, and then go show them your air conditioner. Here's what I want you to look at on the spot. I mean,
Oh man.
that to me, and
Huge.
having that is going to be so much easier if you have a good relationship with your air conditioning company than waiting for 20 other people to establish that with you. So it just makes upsell or resell a lot more comfortable, primes the brain and the comfort level a lot more than
Yeah.
it would most.
So let's take a little bit left turn, because you did talk a little bit about voice and at the home, and you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
talking about this at
Yeah.
Lead Generation World a little bit. We've got the Alexas, we've got Hey Google, and we've got Siri and all this sort of stuff. How are companies sort of preparing to utilize those different channels now that people are going, hey Google, find me mortgage rates? I don't know, whatever the search is. But what's going on there?
Well, the last few years, you've started seeing a lot of people, thank goodness, spend a lot more time on voice search, which I think in particular leads to looking at answers to problems more complexly. When you look at the types of content that's being produced today, I think we think of it too often too linear, as people are going to ask for, again, coffee shop near me.
Right.
So if you think of the way that people search for content versus with paid search, and the way you communicate in your head versus the way you speak, oftentimes there's a difference. I mean, where is the nearest coffee shop versus coffee shop near me, which is almost an expression that's kind of baked in to
Yeah.
most of us now that
Yeah.
use Google or any sort of map pack. You start thinking about a more complex beyond that, though. The types of things that you can do to differentiate your brand in the lead gen space, especially for, here's the problem I'm trying to fix, for not just a coffee shop. Again, I'm gonna borrow this bad example. A coffee shop near me or a Starbucks near me that serves, an ice cold, or let's say quad caramel macchiato, and with soy milk or whatever it is. People need to start thinking more complexly that way with their search in general, but also with their content. And then in regards to that further, how do people actually communicate what they're looking for and how they're having that conversation with Amazon? I found that with myself at first, and that's when I started diving into this a few years ago with the home devices. And then I saw other people and read a lot of information and started applying this with some of the companies that I've consulted with over the years now, how people are searching for those listings, making those more complex. Thinking of search is one. Thinking of your local listings is an offshoot of that. It should be married to that mindset with what you're looking to do and change. Thinking of your local search. Really then start taking a lot of your content. I think it helps you take a lot of your old content and repurpose it. Think of taking everybody and their brother, every entrepreneur that starts up a company right now has a free ebook or free PDF giveaway to solve a problem, or a blog post or something. There's plenty of that kind of content out there. But what if you were taking a lot of that content and maybe even gating it and turning it into a richer, more colorful, with music and sound and lights, as an audiobook or something. Maybe it's a fictional offshoot of that. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at changing some of that existing content. Most companies have content somewhere in their library where they can take it, but repurposing it as opposed to just refreshing 10 words and reposting it to get Google to crawl it new again. This is a way to get people to consume it a little more differently. And there are ways of gating that as well. Maybe you create a podcast about problems that customers have, as opposed to just a podcast about your solutions and services that nobody cares about. I think another one to think about as well coming up, and we'll cover a lot more of these obviously at the session, language differentiation for people specifically. We have such a large Latino market today. There are players in the space. Cute dog, by the way. There are players. I see your dog in the background. There are players in the space specifically that are producing content well, that is English and Spanish content, taking the time to hit a large market that speaks a different language, that has purchasing power. The more of those kind of iterations that you can do, the more you're pulling in those kind of customers who maybe English isn't their first language,
right,
or their primary language. There are ways of pulling in that crowd that are completely different with a medium like audio, where they're speaking in a native tongue, as opposed to strictly reading Chinese or reading Spanish or reading something like that. Look, me as somebody who's lived in foreign countries, I'm always more likely to consume something where I feel it's more native to me when I'm there, than strictly reading it,
right.
As an English paper. It's more of a conversation with somebody about the news as opposed to reading an English newspaper. Another one that I was just thinking about was ADA compliance. I mean, there's certain ways that we have audio content that's generally pointing out larger than it has in the past, that there are a lot of people who cannot consume audio content the same way. Personal friend of mine, had her on my show earlier, and I ended up spending a lot more time talking about this, is Mandy Harvey. She won the Golden Buzzer at America's Got Talent 2 years ago. Known her for a little while, and she is deaf. She got a Golden Buzzer. Her video's been seen over 500 million times around the world. She had sort of a Susan Boyle moment a couple of years ago, and she's still doing well. She's got a new album that came out in 2019 as well. So you think about her, about 1 million people that are deaf, another close to 10 million who are hearing impaired. They're ingesting content differently. And it's not that they just want to read either. There is a lot of content that's podcast created. For example, I got onto myself for not offering transcriptions a lot with that. And a lot of the advancements in technology, where we're having this conversation on Zoom, which I don't even know if it has a transcription service. We had the podcast interview with her on Skype, which in real time, like some of the other services, transcribes in real time with tells us what. That's a lot easier for her to have a conversation than texting somebody because she can't hear it over the phone. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot richer than having somebody squint at a computer screen to see what sign language movements I'm making. And so different ways of thinking about that. There's a lot of other audio, much richer data that I'm going to share as part of the presentation as well, with some statistics of where this is going. So I think people too often get locked into a podcast strategy and think that's the only thing they're going to do. But there's so many other different ways when you broaden that out. I would hope that people would look more as a audio strategy than a podcast strategy.
Yeah. So good segue. So you've got a Shark's Perspective podcast that you've been doing for about 1.5 years now. What's the focus there with that podcast for you? Obviously, this is a personal thing that you do on the side, and interview. I think there's over 100 interviews. Yeah. I mean, you got a ton of content there. So tell me a little bit about that podcast.
So I started out in radio way back when, and then I did radio and TV. And as part of one of those iterations, I did a podcast years and years ago as an offshoot of the radio. And some of the roles were differently. It was a lot different when you think of pirate web radio and all those different things. I was thinking about the old Christian Slater movie, but apologies.
It's okay.
I know it'll be my mother-in-law. She always calls when I'm doing this. I forgot to turn off the radio. But I did, having done radio for years, I turned some of those into podcasts over time and use those as my own content for ways to pull people in. And I use them. I had specific landing pages set up for a lot of this stuff. Now, where I ended up turning that is when I got back into working for a brand, I knew that I couldn't, at the time, I could not take the show back to a large radio station. I had to focus my time on my normal day-to-day job. But I knew that I had a passion for this. I have historically not sold ads on my show. I knew that there was a problem, at least in my mind, in marketing and advertising, and some of the worst practices as opposed to best practices being preached. So in my own little way, I leveraged a lot of the education that I had, the wisdom I thought I had evolved, really having more of a customer focused approach than what a lot of had been typically driven out by a lot of what I thought were bad marketers. I also engaged a lot of the people that I had worked with and known over the years, and some of them just happened to be some massively large influencers with large names out in the space. And so, in particular, when I worked in TV and big data, I had worked with a Fortune 200 and the publishers closely. And of these influencers, the Neil Patels, the Guy Kawasaki's, the Martin Lindstroms, Mark Schaefer's, Ann Handley, Jay Bayer. I mean, the people that as well that have been in the space that have been very nice and good to me. And then they lended their ear, and I'm leveraging also some of their best practices to help do my own little way of highlighting things that I think we can do better. So it hasn't taken over the world yet, but it is honestly a passion project. And I think I am a subject matter learner much more than I am a subject matter expert. As long as I continue to be as curious as I can be for that reason.
Yeah. And that goes full circle, right? Back to what we were actually initially talking about with regards to branding. It's really just being authentic and organic and not being necessarily perfect and everything, but being out there and creating a community that you have, and which is what you've done.
I'm doing what I can to take the shift off of just brands.
Yeah.
And their brand speak and brand babble and stuff that you and I don't want to hear in an ad or anything else. And there's better ways that brands can serve. There's a lot of good that large companies can serve, but a lot of that's really kind of getting lost with the marketing and advertising right now, and a lot of bad lead gen efforts that are just being completely wasted for a lot of different bad reasons. So that's part of my focus, is helping those businesses grow.
So we sort of briefly touched on it, but you're also VP of Marketing and Digital Strategy at AI Media Group. Tell me a little bit about AI Media Group and what you guys are you a full service agency? What's going on there?
We're focused on, thank goodness we are, and it's one of the reasons before I even went to work for them why I grew to love them so much. One, they killed it when I used them for a brand. They did a fantastic job. And I remember having a conversation with a guy on the team early, and I'd known of them in the space because I'd worked with a lot of New York agencies most of my career. But when I was talking to them, they said, I said, do you do this or do you do that? I was several other things I think I was initially looking for as well. And they pushed back and said that they were focused on what they did the best, which is primarily performance marketing, which again is still a broad topic. But they are not trying to be everything to everybody. They are not trying to solve world hunger, which is part of the problem that 99.9% of the agencies don't do. They do very poorly, and they don't stay in their swim lane, to use another shark analogy. But they do performance marketing extremely well. We have a patented attribution technology. And after I worked for a brand, I went to work for them, took some time to think about it. And then I had just such a great relationship, and I believed in their technology, which is a patented attribution technology that allows you to see the full funnel, if you will. And you have to think about that with all the touch points. I mean, a lot of what I talk about is sort of an attribution mindset, is what are all the different touch points and the mixed messaging, and where is all this go into your ad optimization? And so our technology allows us to see that. We do paid search. We're a boutique agency. We are not trying to be, the next IPG or Dentsu Aegis, or one of these massively large brands. We do what we do extremely, extremely well, have a fantastic team. And honestly, it's just a team that I'm lucky enough to have a fantastic boss that helps support me getting what he knows that I know about marketing out there. And that makes a difference as well, because having the right kind of boss to support those kind of efforts is not always the easiest thing to do with an agency. And they're a good group of folks and deliver, killer results. So I've seen them work with a lot of top tier clients, and it's been a great relationship so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I see your point too, because agencies, it's like, a lot of times agencies will be like, a client will ask them, hey, I need some help with this. And what they think that means is dollar signs. And they go,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. We can do that. And we'll go figure it out how to do it. And they're not experts. They don't know what they're doing.
No, we had this conversation on the podcast I interviewed you. When you go through a lot of expo halls,
yeah,
I've got X problem. Okay. As a customer, generally, I've got a problem. That's why I'm coming to you. I'm not saying, hey, if I gave you a bunch of money and if you had enough hours and enough time, could you go figure out what my problems are for me? No. Yeah. I mean, look, especially for where we are today with the demand that's being put on managers, directors, CMOs, CGOs today, if you can't draw a line somewhat to the performance of what you're doing, as opposed to just closing your eyes and hoping if you give somebody a bag of money that it's going to fit. This is how we've sort of gotten into the problem that we've gotten in today. And so luckily what we're able to do with our tech that allows us to look at is we can optimize on what is performing, as opposed to the typical gut reaction that so many people do. And then they come up with bad ideas they give to, there are plenty of good agencies, but there are some bad agencies who run with that and make the mistakes. And honestly, it just costs people jobs. It costs clients money, and then they leave and go elsewhere. And you've got a new CMO in every 2.5 years, like an NFL running back. But if you go down to an expo hall at a lot of conferences and ask a lot of agencies, not at Lead Generation World, of course, but if you go to some other conferences and you ask somebody a generic question, they will give you a generic answer back and overly commit. And that was one of the selling points for me, is they never overcommitted, and I pushed on them a little bit. And that's how it came to be.
Well, that's great. Well, we have to wrap it up, but I really appreciate you spending the time with me this last hour talking about all this stuff. I really look forward to your session at Lead Gen World. If someone wants to reach out to you, should they just go to Kenneth Kinny on LinkedIn, or what's the best way to get a hold of you and check out the podcast and all that stuff?
Thank you for asking. A Shark's Perspective, asharksperspective.com is the website. Kenneth Kinny. And if there's something in relation to the name Kenneth Kinny and Shark, then you have the right guy, because that honestly is who I am as much as it is anything else. I don't claim to be anything other than a marketer and somebody who loves spending time with their family and sharks. And that's it's I'm threading a weird needle, but it's my niche, if you will. But I spend a lot of time, obviously, putting out podcasts, and you'll see me speaking at a lot of different events. But I'm ecstatic and elated to be speaking at Lead Generation World this January.
Well, we're happy to have you. Thanks again for joining. We'll make sure to put some links up for the Shark's Perspective and all that sort of stuff, so people can see more of your podcasts or hear more of your podcasts and check you out and all that sort of stuff. So thanks again, Kenneth.
You're welcome.